So Natalie Drummond is a fiber artist and educator living in Fremont, Indiana. She was awarded a MAFA fellowship in 2019 and has been studying deflective double weave intensely. Natalie also enjoys felting two-dimensional landscapes using part of her hand-woven material. She's also been experimenting and teaching workshops about ice dyeing yarns. And we're all looking forward to Natalie's deflective double weave workshop that she will be giving to us in March that Joanne had mentioned. So if you want to know any more about her background, you can look in the newsletter. So let us now welcome Natalie Drummond.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I'm so pleased to be with you today. I'm on Eastern Time in Fremont, Indiana. And I'm going to be talking and presenting on deflected double weave today as part of your program. But most importantly, how I set up for my deflected double weave. I'll be walking you through that. One of the things that I tend to focus on, or what draws my interest to deflected double weave, the structure, is not just only the structure and the wonderful resulting fabrics that you can get from a variety of different fibers, but the use of color. So there's a lot of information out there on deflected double weave. And so what I was asked to focus on is how I work to set up my deflected double weave. And as a juried artist at the Orchard Gallery of Fine Arts, which is in Fort Wayne, Indiana, again, one of the things that I like to do is I like to kind of mix it up a little bit. I like to I might have a longer warp, say like a 4.5, 5-yard warp, which is what I'll do a little demonstration on, or a mini demonstration on today. And I might weave part of the warp. So here's an example. I've just taken off the loom, and it's got an asymmetrical type of approach. And I am focused a little bit on the indigo color right now in that particular piece. But toward the end of today, my presentation, I'll kind of change up the color of the same warp by working in applying and adding in one of my ice dyed yarns for a different look. So, and of course, I can control that different look by the wefts I use too as well. So I did put, and I see, thank you, Erin, for putting the kind of like the notes, a copy of the presentation. I did supply that to you. So if you wanted to print that out and take notes or add in some details, you'll have that, of course, for the presentation to look back on. So at this point, I'm going to begin with a PowerPoint that I put together. And I'll pull that up. And one moment here. Here you go. So as I mentioned, I really love working with painted warps or ice dyed warps because of the color interactions that I can get. So many of you that maybe are not familiar with deflected double weave, or maybe many of you are and have woven it before. So just a little bit about that. So deflected double weave is a block weave, and you're going to have blocks consisting of at least 2 or more threads. In this particular example, this is a 4-shaft deflected double weave hand woven, And I'm working with 6N blocks. And one of the things that I've done, if you look at the upper right-hand photograph, I have used a 5-2 cotton warp, and I've decided to set it up in a 1-to-1 ratio all the way across my warp. That means every other thread in the threading is going to be this painted warp. So it's not often how I do it, but it gives a continuous kind of look across the whole fabric or resulting fabric. So what's on the other blocks? The other blocks are different, or 9 different remnant painted warps. And you'll see the resulting warp prior to being woven on the lower right-hand side. And those are some examples of some of the other remnant warps that I put in. And then the resulting fabric on the left. So in the 4-shaft draft, or in any deflected double weave, for that matter, you're going to have 3 things going on in your cloth. You're going to have warp floats, weft floats, and then you're going to have areas of plain weave. So the warp and the weft floats are going to move, hence the deflection, into those open spaces that are created by so many different warp and weft floats. So that was the resulting cloth there on the left. In this particular 4-shaft draft, one of the things about it in particular is, and this is an unwashed cloth coming off the loom. So after washing it, the deflection will be enhanced. Because the cells are plain weave are so small, there's 6N blocks that I've worked with in the threading. And then in some cases, I'll work with 6N blocks in the treadling and then 2N blocks. So the resulting fabric can be quite waffle-like in texture. So that's one thing to note, but it's a beautiful use, and it allows me to have a beautiful use of color by enhancing the colors and drawing upon the colors that are in the warp when I choose my weft colors. So that's a little bit about simply my approach. And if one of the things I want to make a note of is I may refer back to this. I originally had it in your paper handout toward the end, but wanted to add that in at the beginning. So the best question, or the most often asked question, is, Natalie, how do you really start your process? Well, if we look at the example on the right, I'm starting with 5 painted warps. This is another draft where I have 6N blocks in a 4-shaft, and I've got my threading plan on the floor. So my threading plan, or my drawdown, just pretty much helps to guide me. And I've set it up in an asymmetrical way in my approach to color. Sometimes I will pay attention to value or color, but the 2 ways that I really work is, I want to draw your attention to the right-hand side, is I will thread up 1 warp at a time. And I will do one of 2 things. I will either, if I'm starting a brand new weave, I'll design in the reed and leave open spaces, or I will tie on to a pre-existing warp, which is sometimes referred to as a dummy warp. So here is an example. I've got 2 warps that I have put on, and you can see in the upper right hand I have some open spaces. So I'll do this by tying on my painted warps onto the front beam, and you can see the lower example there. I'm showing you how it looks with just 2 of the 5 warps threaded up. I've got the warp called Iris. It's an Iris tencel is the name of it. It's painted by Catherine Weber, and that is the warp that is going to the left. And then toward the right, I have laid in the last painted warp, and that is called Seagrass tencel, and that's going toward the right. So, but I've taken you through, for example, 2 examples or 2 different warps there to the resulting 5 warps. So I will, again, the important thing is leaving open spaces. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the presentation. This is to give you an overview. The other thing that I'm most frequently asked with my approach to color is, Natalie, how do you really sit down and plan this? And this is a slide that I ended up putting into the presentation earlier this week, and not necessarily noted on your handout, but there's the same picture that I've shown on the previous slide with the 5 painted warps, the 6 end blocks, my threading color plan. I will often look not just at hue, but I tend to focus a lot of my teaching with weavers or my participants on the value of the yarn. Because when you start to understand how the values interact with not just the hue, but you'll be able to become a better planner and a better weaver with color. So value, again, is referring to the lightness and darkness of the warps. So if you'll see there, I've got some painted warps that are changing from dark to medium. There's very little dark spots. Overall, this is really a more of a medium and you have spots of light color and brightness. They are the ones that look almost white. So the value is important, and I will take all of the colors or all of the warps that I'm planning on thinking about mixing, and I will first lay them out next to each other so I can see how the values align as well as the colors. So, for example, if I'm weaving a very complicated, like this draft here that I showed earlier, this is a very complicated draft. And remember, I mentioned I was focusing on the indigo color on that. But sometimes it becomes important to have some very light colored yarns and very dark colored yarns. So in this case, in this particular 4-shaft, sometimes I look for values. And if I want to have more of a muted effect, I will take a look at the colors and put them in black and white, because my eyes don't always detect and register when I just look at them in color. I sometimes just see the hue, and it can be very surprising. And I've gotten so much better at working at value and working at mixing colors, because in complicated drafts, when you have yarns that are of the same value coming up, it might be necessary to have one of the values be lighter in your weft to accent the design, and then a value that must be very dark. So the design distinction becomes really important to me. And I want to call your attention to the plan on the floor that I showed previously. And you can really see in the plan, you can really see pronounced horizontal and vertical striping surrounding cells of plain weave. So those dark horizontal and vertical striping are sometimes weft yarns, or sometimes warp yarns. Sometimes they are plain weave areas, though, too, as well. So, but one of the things that I tend to try and do is, if I don't want those pronounced stripes, like the plan on the floor, I'll look for yarns that are really close in value color. So the more that you can think in terms of color, in hue, I try and teach my participants to be better at choosing and thinking about value. Because when it comes to creating really graphic weave structures, such as deflected double weave, and like, here, for example, I like to refer to this is like a tic-tac-toe board, and this is like a honeycomb block here. It can become very important if I want those tic-tac-toe boards, or if I want the honeycomb types of shapes to show up in the graphics, or if I'm weaving another deflected double weave and maybe it has circles, if I want it to show up, then value is going to become just really critical. So I added this slide in here. And then I kind of want to talk about some of the benefits of setting up in a front to back method or in tying on a dummy warp. So one of the benefits is there's no lee sticks involved. Now, lee sticks have their purpose in helping to keep weavers organized, but I don't use them because it frees me up and allows me to make some color changes across the warp if I need to. And that's my next bullet point. It allows for color changes as you go. Like I can plan and lay the yarns out next to each other to get a good sense on a table and align them where the colors are going to come up. But, it's always helpful, of course, I think, to be able to see these warp colors, in front of you as you're working with them, and then also on the floor together. When as an earlier weaver, somebody once told me too, if yarns look good together in a pile on the floor together, they're probably going to look great in your woven cloth. So the other benefits are it does preserve and saves threading time. I can tie on to a dummy warp or set up, I can tie on to a dummy warp faster than I can setting up a whole new threading. So that takes me quite a bit of time. And it also can preserve threading. So I'll maybe put on one warp with a threading, and then I might thread on two different color scenarios throughout the course of my weaving on that same warp. So I can find that whereas it might take me several hours to set up originally a new plan with a new threading, I can sometimes tie on to a dummy warp in a couple hours time. So it really saves me. So the other benefit is if you're a person that your brain only works, let's say, setting up from back to front, I usually recommend, tying onto an existing warp is basically the same as tying on to what's called a dummy warp. And a dummy warp might be half a yard in length. And usually it's when you're setting up a dummy warp for the first time, usually it's cotton, like an inexpensive cotton that's strong. And, you might have as much as a half a yard of that, the more inexpensive, like a cotton warp. You might have that being, your dummy warp. But what that allows the weaver to do is set that up in their normal way that they thread up their loom, and then it leaves the existing yarn. They would, beam their dummy warp, so to speak, not very long, but, your dummy warp would appear on the back of your loom. It would be tied on to the back of your loom. So here's an example of a pre-existing warp that I'm using as a dummy warp. So in this case, this pre-existing warp yarn becomes the warp or the dummy warp for my next project. So I tie on, and you'll see I've got little lark's heads knots. Some are at the base, and then some are tied on further up. I've tied those ones that are further up. Those are represent the different blocks. So that's one of the things that I can do, because as you see here, all of these warps, or this particular warp, it's very similar in color, it's very similar in value. So tying the different lark's head knots at different levels can help me to see the existing blocks, and it allows me to see color interaction as I go. So that's just a little bit of the benefits, the time saving part. Again, the comfort level of, like, if you're a back to front using a dummy warp, that is sometimes easier to go through that threading process naturally, and then allowing you to really play with color by tying on. I will say that another thing about back to front, Jane Stafford Textiles talks about ways to set up with back to front using multiple painted warps, using leaf sticks. In other words, on her website and in her class, she refers to it as making ikat stripes. So she'll set one painted warp or a different warp on one set of leaf sticks on the back of her loom, and then another warp, she'll set that up on a different set of leaf sticks on the back of her loom. And that allows the weavers to, like, pull from the different colors, the different warps where they need it in their threading. So those are just some of the benefits. And this is just one of the ways that I can help get my yarns marked by the blocks. Okay, here are the actual real steps. So I'm going to back up now and just give you the steps. So the step one is you're going to tie on one warp at a time to the front beam. So tying it on keeps it secure, and the warps aren't going to go anywhere, so to speak. Step two, I'm going to cut the end of the warp loop, but leave the choke tie. The reason why I leave the choke tie is because as you pull the ends through to tie on, that helps keep basically the other warp yarns in place and from going anywhere. And I usually start with the largest number of ends, and I'll slay. I always start on my right side, and then I proceed to go through the left. So if you look at the photograph there, and those have been pulled through the reeds, in this particular example, you can't see where I've tied it on. In other words, this is an initial setup where I didn't tie on. I've just slayed the reed in the spaces that it goes. So my dominant warp is on the right-hand side, and you can see that all of those warp yarns are on the bottom layer. So you can use painter's tape. That's what most weavers do to separate those layers. So I don't have any painter's tape on there because I'm comfortable, because I do it so often. I'm comfortable with not putting the painter's tape in, but when I first was doing this process, I put the painter's tape in because I wanted to separate the layer, and I wanted to keep those yarns from going anywhere. So then the next step is to repeat the process with your next warp. So I have the warp in the middle. That's my next dominant yarn in my weaving plan or drawdown. I'll layer in those. Again, where is it supposed to go? I will lay those into the open spaces that I've designated in the reed. And then the very last one, this was a three painted warp yarn, is I'll lay in that last layer last. So this photo shows that it's laying in the reed, no tape, but I do recommend tape. And again, leaving open spaces by counting the dents for the warp yarns for 2 and 3, according to my plan. The particular yarns I'm using in this, I'm using a slightly variegated 8-2 tencel painted warp on the right. I'm using an 8-2 ring spun cotton painted warp. You can see that there's certain ends. It's not a ring spun, pardon me. It is a cotton flake. So there's certain areas that it'll add a little texture into the weave. And then a 5-2 tencel, different weights, I will often use too. So that means I have to plan, or what I do is I plan to slay them differently or leave open spaces. So I've already predetermined, how many spaces I'm going to need for the number of ends. So these are my basic steps here. If you're tying onto the dummy warp, like the example that I showed you here, okay, one of the things that I do is I often secure a measuring tape. You can see that I've added that with blue painter's tape. It's often helpful. I certainly can calculate how much I'm going to need as far as the width in the reed, but a measuring tape also can be helpful too, to guide your process along the way. I can separate, and often do this, my dummy warp by lifting the shafts to find the blots, so I can press on the treadles to make sure that I'm working with the right blots. And that helps me also to check for threading areas. So what I can do is I can separate and arrange the layers and blocks by throwing the yarn ends that I want threaded later, and throwing them there and over the top of the beam. And they've got these are the ones with the shorter lark's head knots, but I've just got the painter's tape over it to secure it. And that means I can work on tying on and planning my color for the other layer, which is on the bottom. And I'm referring to that in particular, this is a 4-shaft draft. In this particular 4-shaft draft, I've decided to, they're all weaving block A. In this particular warp, block A is just very simply 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And then in the block B, the yarns that are thrown over top of the reed, the threading is just simply they're on 3, 4, 3, 4, 3, 4. So, but do I have to plan the same color for block A? No, I don't. I can do a lot of different things. The one thing that I've decided to do, and I've marked it with Post-it notes, is I decided, well, on the very right-hand side in block A, I can use one yarn, and I'm going to use that same yarn or painted warp for the other side with a sticky note. And then there in the center, I've got 4 different blocks of block A that I can do a completely different warp if I want to for my design. So I do a lot of designing in the reed with color and using multiple warp ends. So in this case, the largest number of ends is still the yarns that I have under the Post-it note on the right and the yarns I have on the Post-it note on the left. So what I'll do is I'll just kind of, again, I'll tie my warp onto the front beam, and I'll start from left to start and go from right to left, and I'll untie the lark's head knot for the bout, and I'll simply tie on a little square knot and twist it, and I'll do a demonstration at the end of the presentation today. So it's a very simple process as far as tying on. There are some weavers that can do it with one hand. I use one hand to hold my cross, and then the other hand to kind of pull and do the tying. So I use both hands, again, with that one hand holding the cross. Okay, so here it is. Now notice that I went ahead so I didn't get mix myself up. Remember the yarns that were in the center that I said I decided I wasn't going to thread that a different color in block A. You see here how in the center I have just kind of thrown them over the top. The reason being, of course, I just, so I don't forget as I'm going through, as threading is a very, or tying on is a very quick, it's a very easy process. And my mind tends to think about other things, other joyful things, or other things that are going on in my life. So I can, it's easiest to just get it out of the way. The whiteboard is just there so you can see it more easily. I just have placed that there so you can see it. And then what you're seeing me now is doing is an important part of the process. So when you tie your knots, you don't, especially if you working with silks and yarns that are very slippery, you want to make sure, so with my left hand that you can't see, I'm pulling on it to make sure that there's tension. And then I'm just kind of plucking with my right hand and kind of just strumming to make sure all of those knots are secure and that there's good tension, because later on when I pull them through the reed, the last thing I want them to do is become untied. So this is my checking myself process, and it also just kind of keeps everything straight and in order. So I kind of want to stop and just pause for a moment before I go on. And I mentioned that I don't see any comments or questions in the chat. I don't think there are any in there. So, but I just want to pause for a minute to make sure, everybody is absorbing this and to see what questions you might have. So, Erin and Louie, there's probably no questions in the chat. Is that correct, or can you confirm?
I don't see any in the chat, and Julie is also monitoring. Any questions out there? Please either raise your electronic hand. That's probably the best so we can see that. And otherwise, you can raise your real hand and wave it wave it loudly, or just come on off a mute and speak. So I'm not seeing any hands pop up.
Okay.
So I guess continue on.
Okay, Pam I see a question and it kind of disappeared. Do I use a weaver's knot to tie on? I use a square knot to tie on. So, and I will demonstrate that. You will see me doing a little small sample of tying on at the end of today. So I'll reaffirm the type of knot. Okay, as I mentioned, I plan in layers with color. So, if you think about it, planning in layers is kind of equivalent to planning your colors or your fibers in blocks. So, all right, so this is the same warp. And remember I mentioned to you, I was going to put another painted warp into the center. So in this case, I've got that all tied on, and I've got all of block A now tied on. I can stop and straighten my warp by putting it under tension, which is what I'm doing here in the photograph. That's oftentimes what I do. It's like just planning and straightening as you go along. I use my left hand to pull on it again, and then I'll just plumb and strut to get the yarns in place. The rest of the yarns you can see I will straighten and kind of chain them together so that they're on the floor and they stay out of the way. So this is all layer A. The other thing that I do is I will separate any unused warp ends after, that should say retying the cross. I secure the tied on warp in one hand and place under tension. And then the unused warp ends, I'll save them. They're in the other hand. And I will separate them. If you think about it, I've got, the warp that's tied on in one hand, the unused warp ends another end, and I will separate them. The best thing that I can tell you to do is to step on it, because you don't want a huge tangled mess. So I've got the warps under tension. The one that's tied on the loom creates an additional tension. The one that's unused, these are the ones that you want to worry about. I've got them under tension here. And then I will step on the warp with my foot. And then I'll separate. And then I'll separate some more. And then I'll separate. And then I will have to gradually move my foot in these longer warps. And it's usually a pretty quick and easy process, especially if you're working with a newly tied warp. I just work my way back, and my hands and feet, because oftentimes I'm beaming alone. If you had a friend, a weaver friend that's there to help you. But the important thing, it becomes easier when you have a friend, but I do this all the time by myself. So I just am using, again, my foot, working my way back. The important thing is making sure it's under tension. Your warps won't go crazy, right, if it's under tension. And that's what you have to remember to do. If I'm straightening a new yarn, before I ever put it on the loom, or if I'm straightening the leftover warp, I'll tie one end to the front beam, or like if I'm in my dining room area, which is around the corner from my studio, I have a rack, and I'll tie the warp on, and I'll just kind of straighten it, and then I'll rechain it. So the warp chains, the yarns are chained together. They're nice and neat. And then I will tie on the other warp blocks. In this case, it's warp block B. So now it's all tied on, and then I'm ready to beam. So after I straightened and plucked under tension, worked my way back along the chain, this is what it looks like in the photograph. I will stop, and I'll pull the knots carefully through the reed in just little sections. I'll just pull them. And then depending on the loom that I'm using, I might have to beam it like 6 inches, or, wind it on 6 inches or so. Then I'll gradually pull them. I'll take a grouping and pull them through the heddles, moving across the warp, pulling them through the heddles. And then I'll beam a little more. Then with my remaining warp that needs to beam, I can tie on weights, because again, I'm just one person, and I don't have anybody to assist, but I found tying on weights like water bottles. I often have water bottles in my studio, and I find that they're just the perfect weight once filled up. If it's a really long warp, or a really wide warp in the reed, I'll use 2 water bottles. So, and just kind of divide up the warp into just 2 separate parts. And I get great tension by using those weights. So I'll tie it on like just with a gentle loop around the warp around the water bottle, and beam it as far as I can go. Then my beater board moves forward, and then I'm ready to move my water bottle back on the warp, and then beam some more. So beaming is one of my favorite parts of the weaving process, because you get to see all the warp colors come together at that point. Because remember, I'm using maybe many painted warps. So that's the first time. Do we have a picture of those water bottles? We do not have a picture of, in this presentation, of the water bottles. So I'm sorry about that, but the water bottles that I'm using are just simply 16.9 fluid ounces. And I can show you, how about if I show you, if we would put that question in the parking lot, and if Louie and Aaron, I'm sorry, Louie and our other chat host, Julie, I think that is, can help me to come back, please, to the water bottle when I'm on to the little demonstration part. I can do a little mini demonstration. So thank you for asking that question. So your weave plan. So here's another 4-shaft draft. And again, with deflected double weave, you have to know what your weave blocks do. That's important. Remember, in deflected double weave, plain weave is going to function to spread the warp. So those little blocks of plain weave are going to spread the warp. The blocks that, in this case, my block B has a lot of warp floats. That's going to make some room or spaces for the yarn to deflect into in the next block. So when I plan color, I'm thinking about, okay, is this going to be mostly a plain weave block? Is this block going to show up more on the back of the cloth? Because many deflected double weaves, the cloth or the layer that's on the back is seen more than what's on the front. And I choose usually those types of warps for my workshop groups. So I have to know what's happening and where that color is going to go. So is it going to deflect and move or show up more mostly on the underneath side of the cloth as I weave it, or the back of the cloth? That's part of the nature and fun of deflected double weave, is being able to weave a scarf or a runner and show, do you know what I mean, a different look to the back as the front, or sometimes show both sides at the same time if you're wearing a scarf. So you have to kind of think about, and that's what I've come to do. What is it that my blocks are doing? Where do I want the color impact to be? My plain weave cells, my colors usually are going to be more blended there, or more muted, maybe, if that's what I'm planning. Or do I want to get some iridescence? So whereas my warp floats or weft floats, they're going to show up, the color hues are going to show up quite a bit more. So in this case, my outline blocks with that are creating a lot of my warp and weft floats in this particular 4-shaft draft. Here's all my yarns that I've laid out that I'm using. Basically, I'm using a smoke painted warp. I'm using also an ash painted warp, and then I'm using an ice dyed warp. Those are the 3 warps that are basically in this project. The other thing that I put into the warp, as well as to the weft, I'm using an Ito silk noil. That blush or flesh colored example is one where I wanted to have, again, a very light appearance in that. I wanted to add in some of that color. Some of my other yarns that I have laying out are yarns that I'm thinking about. Those skeins are yarns that I'm thinking about for use in plain weave areas, in the plain weave cells as wefts. So anyways, this is what I call my yarn play, where I take my yarns out and I start to look at the colors, not just the hue, but also the values of them. So, but it's important to know when I'm planning, I'm thinking about what the draft is telling me and where those yarns are going to go in the structure, thinking about the front and the back, or where those yarns will deflect to, will help determine again, where those yarns go. So I have that knowledge base. There are also fun things that I like to do. Like in this case, I will plan my color and my deflected double weave. I'm shifting some yarns. Now, here are the reasons that I shift. And when I say shift, I mean that the painted warp that's here in the center is kind of, it's probably the smoke painted warp, but it's very dark. And you can kind of see my hands are kind of aligning it. It's kind of got an arrow or a chevron kind of float sharpening in. So if you follow your eyes along my pointer finger there, you'll see in the upper portion of the draft where that dark yarn in the certain blocks is kind of shifted. So why do you shift yarns? You can move colors around that may have different values to make a pattern. In this case, it was kind of like an arrow or a point. So people make chevrons that way. You can move around overpowering colors. So maybe I've got an example that I've woven that's in my workshop monograph where I had just such a bright orange, and rather than the bright orange going all the way across the warp, I shifted one side of the warp so that it was not overpowering and ended up that bright orange here as woven and then down here in one part of the warp. So it's like, I like to think of an analysis or analogy to when painters paint their canvases. I think of this yarn as my canvas and I move colors around and it gives more interest. So it's a design element. So too much of one color shows up, then I can think about shifting it because, so in other words, I like all the colors together, like I'll go back to my plan, but is there a reason to add a design element or shift or move colors that are too overpowering? In this case, it was not an overpowering reason. It's just one I wanted to have a little bit more of an impact in my design element. The other thing where I'll tend to do this is if I have colors that are coming together in warps that are aligning, like for example, it's hard for me to do complementary colors of red and green. So if I have warps that are red, that have some red areas and green areas, if I shift them, well, maybe that green area shows up next to an orange or a yellow, and it becomes less of a complementary color. So I will shift them so they'll come up to colors that maybe are more analogous or a split complementary color. Because if you've woven a lot of red and green together, especially in cells of plain weave, or areas of plain weave, you can get a muddy color effect. So that's one of the techniques I do. So the implication to that is there is some yarn waste. So if I'm doing that, I'm really considering it either as a design element or a reason to shift. Again, the color reason, because if you waste, I do it by cutting off the amount of yarn that I want to shift. In this case, well, let me go ahead to the future slide. Here's another example that shows it. So here is the center of the warp at the top. Draw your eyes to the center of the photograph, and at the top, you can see where I have shifted and that you're seeing the opposite part of that arrow or that chevron, and it's moving down. So I've shifted it by cutting blocks on the very edge, a block over here, 8 inches, and a block over here, 8 inches. Then I take the next block and I shift and I cut 4 inches, 4 inches, and then 4 inches on the other side. And then I'm going down to the next block in the plan as I work toward the center. So you have to have an uneven number of blocks to do this with. So in this case, I had 2, 4, 6, I had 7 blocks that I was manipulating. So 2 inches, then 2 inches, and I can save what I cut off here to make sure it's the same amount of what I cut off there. And then the center of the chevron, I only just cut off 1 inch just for a slight shift. So that's how I get that. Those are, more detailed designs that come into play, but that's one of the design techniques that I kind of can teach or assist. And it's one of the ways that I work with color. So this is again, showing the shift that I've created during the tie-on process of the dummy warp, showing the other yarns that I've tied on in the layers, and then showing what the existing warp looks like after it's all tied on and pulled through the reed and pulled through the heddles. And then that's my resulting sample or woven cloth. I'll point out in that particular example here, those were, so the woven samples really looks like this. I was using a very fine silk as one of the wefts in that particular example. This is just sewing thread to separate my blocks because I was going to wash it up. So that's not a part of the woven cloth. That dark line you see going up, it just was to separate. Okay, going back to the 1-to-1 ratio. So the other thing that I can do is I can pick certain parts of my draft and I can do a design element in small increments, and I can pick sections where I want to do what I call a 1-to-1 ratio. 1-to-1 ratio means in the threading block. So if the threading block is block A is 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, well, I might want to put all one yarn color on heddle 1 and a different color that contrasts on heddle 2. So how do you find those places? Well, I've isolated the block and the arrow is pointing to the block that I'm going to do this with when I tie on in my plan. And it's just a very small block that I'm showing here. And I have lifted my shafts, and lifting your shafts by having your tie up, correct for your weave structure, that just helps you to separate. It helps to separate the 1 and 2 so you don't have to look back. So I separate them, I find what those ends are, and I have one of the ends set is held underneath my thumb. So this example, in my left hand, I have all the threads under my thumb. I threaded on shaft 1, and I'm planning to put a dark thread on that or tie on a small dark thread. The other threads between my pointer finger and my middle finger, they're all going to be threaded on shaft 2. So, and I've got the lark's head knots, I can separate them. I don't have to continue holding them in both hands or in that one hand. I can just work with those, but it allows me to separate them so that I can begin and know which yarns that I'm working with so that they always come up when I'm weaving tied onto the correct shaft. I call this a faux shadow weave effect because you can really have a play on colors by having small blocks be it followed by a light and dark thread. And that is another color technique that I use to get more color interest in my warp. So, and then here's a example of another plan in the way that I plan color. Now, my goal for this particular draft is I was really focused on trying to get some greens. I wanted to have a lot of greens that were earthy in nature in this. So in my particular plan, I had yarn 1 was block A, which I mostly was going to weave, and I knew that that was going to weave a lot of plain weave. So I used the riverbed warp. The riverbed warp was dyed by Shiny Dime Fibers. Her name is Amanda. So that's the bottom warp in the photograph. You don't see much of it, but it was kind of like a light blue, a light green. It's very earthy looking. Then I also am planning to put 4 blocks of spruce in space. This was the one that I mentioned earlier. That was the very dark color, and I'm going to go back to this particular slide. That's this, going on the loom. So I find writing out is helpful for what I want to do. So that's what I'm going to put. Those are my first yarns that I put on. The riverbed and the ones that I ice dyed. That's very dark in color. It's called, the dye that I used was like a deep space color, and the other yarn, the other dye I used was spruce. So that was my goal. Then yarn 2, the second set of yarns are going to go on block B. Those are the ones that are going to, in the 4-shaft draft, they're going to create a lot of warp floats on the face of the cloth. What's going on under the back of the cloth is going to be some weft floats, right? If you've got warp floats on the face of the cloth, you know you've got to have either weft floats on the back or on the underneath side underneath, or maybe some small areas of plain weave in, like I have in another 8-shaft draft. I won't go into that right now, but we may get into that for some of the weavers that are in my workshop classes. So, and then in block B, I have a yarn that I've overdyed of spruce and timberwolf. That's the second yarn from the top. That's next to the deep space. Now, those are going to give me really strong and dramatic. They're really different in values. I've got a really dark yarn, and I'm kind of, that's more of a medium color. And then the other colors are also very medium colors. They're also going to go in some areas in block B. So that's a kind of a camouflage silk noil, Ito silk noil. And then I've got some soy silk that I color pooled that's dyed by interlacements, and that goes from a medium green and a sandy color to a blue color. And then I've got another yarn that's more of a goldish green. It's got a lot of olive tone in it. It looks more golden in this particular photograph. It's the same color though that's on the bobbin at the top, but I've got that in the warp. So again, I like to look at color in this way, but I also have to look at my deflected double weave draft and know where those yarns are going to go. So this is kind of like the end, and then I would just want to go back to the very first slide just to refresh your memory and see if there's any questions. So again, this is a 4-shaft example, and I have it in your notes at the end. So this is an example of the resulting fabric where I'm working with 6N blocks in a 4-shaft, and I'm producing small cells of plain weave that's surrounded by, I like to call it the outline yarn of warp and weft floats, where I'm using different painted warps or leftover pieces. So at this point, I kind of want to stop before we go to a short video to see questions about the process. I know we have the parking lot of the water bottle, but what other questions, or just give a moment for people to put any questions about the presentation part from the photographs before we switch back to the video. And I'll give people a moment to put any questions they might have in the parking lot. Don't be shy.
Natalie, this is Julie. You have well, your color sense is amazing, but would you speak about cool colors versus warm colors a little bit, and how you utilize those.
Okay. And then I saw that there was another, so if another question that came up in chat about the wool, and then Joanne has a question about, so this would be very important. Okay, so very quickly, warm and cool colors. I like to do some weaving with warm and cool colors. So I guess my approaches to warm and cool colors is one of the things that I tend to do. I typically in the past have not been drawn to yellows, so to speak, and usually when my previous in putting together warps that have a lot of perhaps yellow in them, I tend to go more toward the warm yellow rather than a cool yellow. When I say a cool yellow, I might think of something like a daffodil yellow or more of a pure yellow, whereas I tend to go with more of a yellow that has the warm tones in it. So tone is probably one of the hardest things to create or approach in weaving. And oftentimes when people are weaving with, let's say, all colors of the rainbow that have warm and cool colors in it, one of the things that is a surprising technique that I often teach people is what's at the middle of the spectrum. Roy G. Bev, all right, the rainbow, green. So green is a weft color or another color that can work to help bring your warm and your cool colors together. So I try to encourage people to think about that color and how it can, rather than jumping across the spectrum, so to speak, is to think about green and how that it can enhance your weave. So for example, if I want to mute it, I will go more toward olive green. If I want to brighten it, then I will go more toward a lemongrass green. So, and then the other thing that I will do in my color approach when I'm working with both warm and cool colors is I sometimes will go, as I mentioned earlier, I don't like to do a lot of complementary, but what I will do is I'll go toward a split complementary, and I'm going to step away and get my little color wheel here. So your knowledge and use of the color wheel is going to be helpful to you. Let's just take my red and let me just take my complementary colors, my red and green together. So I find myself, and I know this is jumping away from your warm, cool colors, so to speak. So, but your red and green are located opposite each other, the color wheel. Well, you can go to what's called a split complementary. That's one of my color techniques that I'll do, meaning rather than weaving like, say, with a green weft yarn or putting in more green, you can go toward a yellow green, which is like the lemongrass I mentioned, or you can go more towards a blue green or aquas. So that's one of the things I try to approach or I try to teach is that I give everybody the green lecture and I say olive can be your friend and olive can help mute. And so there are other colors that'll work that way. I mean, that was the green example, but so you have to decide whether you want to brighten something or lighten something. So it's hard to teach tone in weaving. So, but that's one approach that I take. Tends to be the main one when I tend to weave warm and cool colors. Other weavers might have other approaches. So, and I've grown to really actually love and enjoy weaving with more yellow and more cool colors, like with the cool tone of yellow. All right, so that is probably as much as I could spend on that. And there were other questions. I can't see all the questions that went into chat, so I'm gonna call on Louie or Julie to help me go through those questions.
Certainly. From Virginia Lee, do you ever use wool?
Absolutely. I do use wool. One of my favorite wools to use is wool blends, like Zephyr, a 50% merino wool and 50% tencel, or excuse me, silk. And then another wool blend that I love to use is 210 merino Coleraine lace that Web sells and other yarn stores. It's 50% merino wool and 50% tencel. Another, sometimes the knitter stores, I have a great knitter store in Fort Wayne. So I ran across this wool blend that I really like. It was made by Shibui Knits Pebble, and it is a cashmere, wool, and silk blend. I've also worked with in deflected double weave. I'm not a spinner, so I can't spin the yarn really fine like many weavers do with wool, but Uppingham Yarns in the United Kingdom. So I've done some weaving classes and workshops with some weavers of Great Britain. And so they kind of directed me toward Uppingham Yarns, and it's 100% lamb's wool that's really fine. So it's spun in the United Kingdom. It's merino lamb's wool, and it's virgin. It's the softest wool that lamb will ever produce. And they spin it, Uppingham Yarns, the spinners spin it really fine. So I do like to use wool blends, and I do teach people in the workshop. I usually give them the option to put in, and one of our samples during the workshop, I always say, on sample 3, even if you don't have it in the warp, I'm going to have you put a wool blend in as to see how that affects differential shrinkage, because you can have different shapes produced in deflected double weave with differential shrinkage using your wool blends yarns with more of your non-shrinking yarns. Which would be like, for example, your tencels and your cottons when you compare them to how much the wool blends shrink. Okay, and then the next question was in the chat room.
So Elizabeth asks, how do you work in your ends?
Okay, so I'm thinking that she's meaning that the ends that are as woven when I change colors. So I try to, this is what I try to do. I try to do shuttle diving so that I don't have very many weaving ends to weave in. But the deflected double weave structure is very simple. Like if I forget, to manipulate my shuttle and I'm changing a color, I can leave that end out, of course, and actually weave it in later. Because there's so much plain weave usually set up, it's easy just to kind of weave those ends in with the structure. Plain weave areas over under. The other thing that I do is, like, if I'm really working hard, like let's say you run out of during the weaving process and I want to change colors and you want a really nice finished product, I will do a splice of my yarn so that, like in a 2-ply, like there's about maybe an inch or half an inch of the 1-ply of the one yarn and then a half an inch or an inch of the other ply, so that when you put it together, you don't have a lot of buildup. So what's the next question in chat? I think that there's more coming in.
There are. Joanne says, I don't understand how you keep the ends in order without lease sticks. Thanks, Natalie.
Okay, so that can be frightening to people without having the lease sticks. So, and when so one of the things that I want to stress is the choke tie. When I'm putting it, when I'm starting to do the tying, The choke tie helps to keep the yarns in order and from going everywhere. So that's one of the things that I do is I leave in the choke tie, especially near the end when I'm threading it. The other thing that I do is I try to follow my plan. So you don't want like this yarn going all the way across the yarn warp and tying on to the other. And I think probably, Joanne, I'll probably try to revisit that question when I can be at my loom and show in the demonstration at the end. But that I do want to stress the importance of, I mentioned rechaining there. And also, again, the lee sticks would only be recommended if you're doing Jane Stafford's method, where you're setting up from back to front and you're putting different warps on different lee sticks. So that would be the only time I want to clarify that, when a weaver might want to use lee sticks. So not having them on the front, it frees it up, and it frees you up to make, changes, but there is there's straightening as you go along. Okay, what's our next question?
So Pam asks, how do you know what blocks that the various hand-dyed yarns are threaded on? Should some blocks be solid colors?
Okay, so that's a design choice. And yes, some blocks are colors. I do so much experimentation with colors. I do usually, oftentimes, most of the times I will have the blocks be the same color across the warp. So in other words, like if I'm weaving with the 8 shaft, like I can, like, and it has 4 blocks. I'll have block A be one color, block B be one color, block C be a different color or a different painted warp, and block D be a different painted warp. So lifting my shafts can be a help, and having a tie up already done can help you separate, what the blocks are. And I will group them and separate them. So I don't know, Pam, if that answers maybe part of your question, but your question was a long and lengthy question. So that was a 2-part question. So let me have you read that again to me. I want to make sure I captured her question.
Okay, it said, how do you know what blocks that the various hand-dyed yarns are threaded on? Should some blocks be solid colors?
So usually I recommend for a person that is like first like learning to work with, say, multiple painted warps, is to set up some solid colors. And like I usually allow people, like, to their color level. Like, so let's say the 8 shaft brocade that's in my workshop monograph, and I'm just going to kind of go to the workshop monograph here for a minute. So here's one way you can set it up. And this is the example that's on Handwoven Magazine, the cover in November, December 2021. So this is weaving with 1 painted warp, and the other is a solid silk. So there's basically just 2 yarns. And I know which shafts that they go on because I have my draft to follow. So in the threading plan, of course, if I'm threading that up, they're going to go on certain shafts. So the question is, or you have to know, what your draft is doing. So for example, and, when I plan it, like I know that in this case, I want my outline yarn, which is making up the warp and the weft floats here, to be a solid color. So it's a solid color in the warp. And then my painted warp is on the other block. So the solid color is actually on 2 blocks. The other thing that I do is just kind of like add in, I call this the center of the dragonfly. This is like a dragonfly, people say. So I gradually will add in like a 3rd color. So if if you're not used to mixing multiple painted warps and multiple colors together, I usually ask for people to start with one or two, depending upon their comfort level. Like that draft can be woven with 2 painted warps and look absolutely beautiful. So I've got some examples and we can kind of go over. Here's an example of 2 painted warps, no solids. So it just depends upon what's in your stash. Like I work with solids too. It just depends upon a design element, what I want to create. So probably, like I know Pam is in the workshop. So we're going to have, Joanne contacted me and indicated that we're going to have a pre-workshop Zoom on February 12th, which is a Monday at 4 p.m. Mountain Time. So that would be for workshop participants. So I would ask for participants perhaps maybe to have a painted warp in hand that night and to have have their workshop monograph that Joanne is going to distribute so that you spend some time thinking about, what's the main yarn that I want to weave with. And then also what draft, I'm going to go with during the workshop. So we'll have to touch more about it because you can go so many different directions. So, but also lifting the shafts. A lot of people lift their shafts permanently when they're threading so that they can see the different blocks. That's something that I did earlier on that I don't have to do. But if I'm tying on, I'm able to lift my treadles and lift my shafts so that I can see the different blocks. Okay, and then was there one more question? I feel like there maybe was another question.
Yes, and then Pam also asked, when you use 5-2 and 8-2 in the same warp, what set do you use? 20 EPI?
Okay, so actually I mix sets. So this is a free digital download to I have on my website, nataliewoven.com, my master set chart. And these have different weights or commonly used fibers that I weave with, and then they're recommended sets. So, and certainly those in the workshop monograph, like say, for example, a 5-2 tencel, and I'm mixing it with an 8-2 tencel. Well, my rule of thumb is whatever the main size of the fiber is in the draft I'm using, I will set that yarn closer to plain weave. So my 5-2 tencel will be set close to plain weave at 16 EPI. And then the blocks that I have my 8-2 tencel on, I will set those more toward a twill, like at a 24 EPI. So I will mix sets with fibers for the best deflection, to answer that question. So then, as I mentioned, so everybody can go, and it's a free digital download, my master set chart with deflected double weave, to see what kind of set ranges I've experimented with. And that comes from a lot of sampling and mixing fibers. And then, like I said, articulating it out. And it might change some depending upon the different deflected double weave draft that I'm weaving. So that's why there's a range in that. And the fibers that I'm mixing it with too. Okay. Was that the last question? And I think Erin, thank you, Erin. I think she put in the chat group, I believe she put in for everybody the link to hopefully my website, nataliewoven.com. And it would be what's called in the notes section of my website. I call them Natalie Woven Notes. And that is my master set chart. It's also usually the last page also of the workshop monographs. So at this point, what I think since
Natalie?
Yeah.
There's actually 2 more questions.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought that, okay.
There's a couple
Let's-
more. Julie, do you want to read those?
Yes, so Joanne asks if you're using wool or wool blend, do you use it in both warp and weft with Tencel?
Okay, so I will use it on certain blocks. So different patterns, I will recommend wool blends on certain blocks. So it depends. I have woven 100% deflected double weave with all wool, but most of the times, yes, I will mix the shrinking yarns with the non-shrinking yarns. So shrinking yarns will go, let's say, on certain blocks, blocks A and C, and non-shrinking yarns will go on the other blocks, blocks B and D, so that they're separated out. And the washing and finishing can help give you the differential shrinkage that can help change up some of the deflected double weave drafts patterns. And then what's our next question?
Our next question, hopefully our last question right now anyway, is Christy asks, so back to front always requires multiple sets of lease sticks?
That's one option. That is the option that most, again, I'm not an expert on back to front. That is the way many of my participants who only like to do back to front set up. And it's a good recommendation that they follow. And then what they follow is what Jane Stafford teaches. So like, for example, one painted warp goes on one lease stick set, and then another painted warp goes on a different set.
Okay, I think that's it for the questions.
I would say, in general, I would encourage most people to set up a dummy warp. Like those are the two methods I recommend for back to front people. Multiple lease sticks or different lease sticks for different warps on the back, or tying on to a dummy warp. Okay, now we're ready to show the video where
Great.
I'm actually at my loom.
And Natalie, would you like me to come back to you after showing the video?
Yes, I'm hoping
Okay.
that we have time because I did want a demo.
Yeah, we have about 20 minutes left total, and I know the video is about 8 minutes. So
Okay, and you're
Okay.
able to show that.
yeah, stand by. And just a note, there's no sound at the beginning.
Mhm. Welcome to For Chef Focus, Designing in the Read. I've got a project that I'm setting up here, and I will take you through the design process that I'm attempting with this For Chef for the warp. So right now I've got all my yarns threaded up on block A, which depending upon the tie up that you choose, block A will weave a lot of plain weave. So I've got 5/2 tencel. The majority of the warp at these selvages and also at the center is this smoke dyed warp. And I love it just because it goes from really light in value to dark. I also found in my stash some ice dyed yarn of 5/2 tencel. So it has mostly a darker value. It has a little bit of a speckly type of look. But I've got that threaded up on 3 different blocks of block A. here. So because I was thinking that I might want to have some dark yarns on that particular side of the warp. And then I've got 3 solid light colored value yarns, or rather 3 blocks here. I've got kind of a greenish gray tencel, and then I've got a lavender gray tencel, with the center block being threaded up in a 1-to-1 ratio. So pretty light in color. So the next decision I have to make is what yarns I'm going to tie on for block B. Now, before I do that, I'm a little bit contemplating what I would like to do here in the center with this smoke. I have shifted the warps to give a sense of ikat that's going on here. So that was a purposeful shift that I wanted to enhance a little bit of the feathered look created in the project, but it will only show up at the very end and then in the middle and the beginning of the warp. So I've really only got 2 opportunities to really showcase when I choose my weft what to do with this, but it shows up very beautifully here, and I'll explain this shift in just a minute of what I did to get that. But one yarn that I've decided to use in the project is this dark colored ice dyed tencel. So I could put that over here as a dark yarns. I might think about, well, let me go over the other dark yarn. So the other dark yarns that I have that I like the effect with in ice dyed is a silk noil. I've got 2 different colors here, but pretty dark in value. And then if we go over to the lighter side, I've got a lighter yarn here called Smoke and Ash. And I really like the colors and interplay of colors here with these lighter colored solid dyed tencels. And then I've got some light silk noil here, a charcoal gray, and kind of a peachy color that I think also looks nice with this color combination. So one of the things that I could do is I could, since I'm working with a different block, is I could juxtapose these and actually move the darker yarn on this side and the lighter yarn over here. So that's one thing that I could do. What to do about the center, I would love to be able to have the reverse of this smoke yarn, which I don't have, where it would be really light colored here and then dark colored in here. So, but I've looked around in my stash and I don't have anything that will work. But the other thing I could do is I've got these ice dyed warps here, another ice dyed warp. It would bring in some more color. I could look at putting that in that section here on block B. So lots of decisions to make as I finally plan out the remainder part of the warp with color, but there's just so many opportunities. Let me explain the shift that I have going on so you can see that. So the shift takes place when or before I tie on. It can also take place after I tie on a warp. So here's where my previous warp ended. So some of you have a dummy warp. And those are all tied on at the same place. But up here, I've tied it on about maybe 8 inches or so back. Here, and then also here. And the reason why I chose 8 inches was because that was going to give me a good shift here, but it also depends upon how the yarn is dyed. So, and then in the next block, I have shifted maybe only about 4 inches here. And then also 4 inches over here on this side. And then I've got one that shifted about 2 inches here, 2 inches here, and then it's a little bit harder to see. It's not going to have a huge impact, but the center one is shifted only about 1 inch. So just wanted to show you that as kind of as you're thinking about planning your warps with color and color values, and just to give you some preparation for what is going to take place while we're designing in our looms in our workshop.
Okay.
All right. Thanks for that. That short video just reiterated some of the things that I explained in the PowerPoint. When I talked about cutting and shifting the yarns, you may not have been able to see, but the shift that I'm referring to when I'm talking about 8 inches is where the knot is forming. So at this place, I logged on to my other device. So I'll ask Erin's assistant if we could spotlight my loom so I can take you to a small sample for
Yep.
demonstration.
Yeah, hold on just a second. Is that on a different?
It's on a Natalie Drummond.
There you
So-
go. Okay, I gotcha.
So if we could
Okay.
spotlight that for everybody so that they
Okay.
see my loom.
There you go.
Wonderful. Okay, so everybody can see hopefully my loom. And here's the existing warp that I have. And what I'm going to do for you, or what I'm going to show you, is let me get the cross in my hand for a minute. So I have this beautiful ice dyed warp, and I'm going to put the cross and remove the string. I have already cut the ends here, and I'm leaving the choke tie. This leaving of the choke tie helps to keep the yarns in place. I've got it tied on firmly to the front beam, and then also I've got the rest of it chained. So this is yarns that I've dyed. These are ice dyed yarns. And what I'm going to do is I've got isolated here blocks in this particular one that I'm going to tie on. Now, this is just a mini demo. So let's just say though that this was the last warp yarn that I would tie on, my last change, the minimal change. Typically, I would not have all my yarns tied on, but because it's an existing warp, remember that yarns that are under tension stay under tension. So these yarns that I'm going to replace, the best way that I can keep them from moving around, it's kind of like thinking about replacing maybe a broken warp end, is have all your other yarns from your warp tied on and under tension. So I've got the cross in my hand. And let me just make sure I have it positioned so that I pull from the cross correctly. And I'm going to work from right to left. I'm going to take the warp end, and I'm just going to pull from that choke tie, the first one in the cross. I'm going to twist the ends to keep them together, and I'm just going to tie a square knot. And then I can pull that kind of back and go on to the next one. Pull the next one, twist the ends, tie the knot at about the same place. For me, it usually ends up being about 1 centimeter up. Take the next yarn in the cross. Hopefully it's the next yarn there, and same thing. So I'm just going to continue tying all the way across. You don't need a lot of yarn. Like if, let's say, imagine that this was my dummy warp. You don't need as much. I need about at least 9 inches hanging down in front of me in order to tie on. Right now, I've got about 1 foot. So you just do it, of course, according to your comfort level. So this is how I change out yarns on a longer warp to create different projects, because sometimes, like my effect here was to create an indigo project that I might have for sale at the Orchard Gallery of Fine Arts, but now I want to have and bring in some different colors to make it, to weave my second item. So that's sometimes, again, what I do. I can also use this process to replace yarn ends to give it a different design look, that use a 1-to-1 ratio. I can basically do anything that I want with color. So right now, this is going to create an asymmetrical look in color, with this being different than the same blocks that are over here in this weave. So right now, this will give me an asymmetrical color design with weaving the same blocks. So that's a fun thing to do with color for me. So I've done many different examples where I sometimes will put, again, 1-to-1 ratio, or sometimes I will put an accent color in, either among the blocks or within the blocks. So that's a play on color that I can do too as well. 20 ends, sometimes I will replace as little as 8 ends to make these accents. So the yarns here are kind of going all over the place. So I can just kind of pull back on them, put them under tension. You see how they just went right back into place. I don't worry about that. So see how I just, twisting those ends just keeps them together. There are many weavers that can do this with one hand. I need 2. My hands just don't work to tie a knot with one hand, but it works for me this way. Sometimes, my hands, as I've aged, get a little bit, cramped, so I can take a break if I need to, like if I'm working on a 235 warp end. Take a break and come back to it on a different day. Okay, so I'm getting near the end of the yarns that I want to replace. 2 more to tie on. And again, I want to check the tension. The last thing I want is for me to lose the knot. So here's all the yarns. I can do this to keep the yarns in place. I can work my way back. Okay, so now I've got 2. My choke tie, it's a little bit loose. I could retie that if I wanted, but I am going to secure my cross. Now, some weavers, I know Pam, I received, I think it was an email question from you about, do you have the exact number of ends in your warp, like if you're dyeing them? And I don't dye the exact number of ends. Sometimes I will wind an exact number of ends, but usually most of the time I just work in this way that that way it allows me to keep these remnant warps, is what I like to call them, or these other little warplets for other accents and other projects. So I just resecured the cross. It looks like I didn't get around everything. So let me just kind of go back and make sure that that's at least pulled in there for now. Now, so I'm just going to pull that out. Do you see how easy that was? I just took them all and pulled them through the reed. And then I'm going to wait for a minute. And then I'm going to, I have these leftover yarns. So what I'm going to do is, and you won't be able to see me how I stretch out, I'm going to untie my yarn from the front beam. And I'm going to do what I can to separate it. So I get it on the same side of the beam, and it's going to naturally pull back through here. And that's okay. And they're already falling apart. They're separating on their own. So here they are. So I'm just going to step on it. Now, if I'm by myself and not demonstrating this on Zoom, I can just, I'm working my way back. I can spread out, but you won't be able to see it on the camera. But here we go. And then the warp has gotten caught on my camera in there. See how easy that is. Now, technically, the chain came undone, and I might have this chained, or I typically might have this chained. There we go. Just pulled away there. And so I've gotten to the end of this choke tie, and then I've gotten to the end of this bout. So what I do have to do is I untie the choke chain, or untie it. If I want to leave this, in other words, not cut this loop that's on the back, so then I can set this aside, this other yarn, I can rechain it and use it for a different project. So, and then here, oops, I'm so sorry about that. I'm going to go ahead and chain this now. So you'll see me. So here we go. Now, this was, if I was redoing the whole warp, I might have a couple of chains for the different warps. So here's the thing with the water bottle. All right. And now I'm not ready to use the water bottle yet because I haven't pulled this through to the other side. But typically what I'll do is I'll have a lark's head knot in the water bottle. And you see here how they're hanging like that. All right, it's under tension. So remember earlier, I'm in your instructions, I mentioned I would pull those through. And then the next thing I'll have to do is I have to pull them through. And this takes a little bit more time in finding which ones are going to be pulled through. And I probably will stop here and ask for questions, but usually I'm going to get on the other side of my loom. And then I have to stop and straighten. If they get out of place, I can just, but anyways, that's what I do as far as the water bottle. And I do want to say, I usually don't put the water bottle on until all of, right now I'm just doing a mini demonstration for what I do. So I treat these yarns on the other end of the loom after I pull them through. I can do one of two things. Most oftentimes, I just will treat them like a broken thread. I will warp them and weight them off the back. Most of the time, I can weight them in bundles together because they're in the same block and they have the same take up. The other thing that I could do is I could decide to completely rebeam if I'm replacing a lot of threads, but I don't tend to do that. I just simply weight them off the back and don't have any problems with that. So, but that's what I do with the water bottles. If I'm working with the whole warp, when I'm beaming and winding on, I can use, again, like a couple of water bottles for a wider warp. Some people, I think, even use maybe gallon jugs. So I think that is the little mini demonstration that I wanted to kind of demonstrate how easy that can be to separate yarn and the importance of having that choke tie in there that Joanne asked me about earlier to make sure that those yarns kind of stay together and, you know, keep from intermingling with the other yarns. It certainly gave you some information about how I work with color and the things that I do, because the more you can learn to work color, whether you choose to weave deflected double weave or a different weave structure, the more techniques that you can gather in your hat to work with color in both a value and a hue point, the more it can enhance all the weaving that you do.